all claim to have their own state. And if they all get their own state, the Austro-Hungarian Empire is going to fall apart. Right? So for example, Croatia was a part of the Austrian Empire, right down here. And now because of nationalism, Croatia is an independent country. So it's no longer under Austro-Hungarian control. Right? So that's a threat. The Austrian Empire does not like nationalism because it will lead to it being split up into different pieces. Because each one of these nations could have their own state. And also, for example, Italy could claim this chunk here because this is actually mostly Italian people that live here. This is actually, just as an aside, if you're watching kind of the issues today with Russia and Ukraine, that's an issue there, right? Because Russia's claiming a part of Ukraine territory, which is predominantly populated by ethnic Russians, right? So that's why it's kind of dangerous. We see that influencing the world today. So the other question was, how does this kind of, how do you spread this, right? How do you convince people they should put loyalty to the state above loyalty to their families and their country, and their religion, their faith? Well, one way is through compulsory education, right? You make sure everyone speaks the standard language. For example, my wife is from the Philippines. She doesn't speak Filipino at home. She speaks a dialect, a separate kind of language. But in her school, she has to learn the national language. You also learn a national history. Right? For the United States, you study American history predominantly. You don't study German history. And also, of course, the United States, how do you start off each school day? Pledge of Allegiance to the flag, right? That's encouraging nationalism. Another way is through compulsory military service. United States and Great Britain didn't have this, but most European countries did have or still have it. You have to have a large number of citizens. You need a large army to protect your country from foreign and domestic threats. You don't want your military, though, to rebel. Right? If you form this large army together, the army may say, well, we don't want to be loyal to the king anymore. We're going to overthrow the king and set up a military dictatorship. So you had to make really clear, you had to kind of convince your army that they had to be nationalistic, that they had to be loyal to you. And of course, you can kind of think of this, right? Most soldiers tend to be patriotic. Right? So you spread this in part through the army. And also you spread it through newspapers, through national news. Right? You know, I've never been to Wyoming, but I did recently read about how there's these issues about coal use in Wyoming in Greenwood Index Journal. Right? Through the newspaper, I have a sense that this place called Wyoming, that I've never been to, is a part of my country, that the people who live there are also Americans. Right? So you also spread this, you get people to think beyond their village, to think beyond Greenwood, to the rest of the world, through things like newspapers. And so notice, I just want to point out also, this is a list of 3 things. If I was going to ask a question on the test, I could easily eliminate, just add a false one, and that would take care of my question. Okay, so that was nationalism. Any questions on that? Basic ideas of communism. I'll come back to. I kind of got them out of order. I apologize. Well, we'll do this. How did Britain successfully deal with difficult economic and political issues it faced in the 19th century? Right? Remember, Britain in the 19th century is going through the Industrial Revolution, and that's causing problems, right? Because a lot of factory workers are not paid very well; they're treated badly in the first half of the 1800s. You had this rising class of bourgeoisie people who demand a say in the government. This is kind of a problem. You also have child labor. You have all these problems, and the British deal with it by expanding democracy. So the bourgeoisie are growing in power. So the government, instead of saying, well, we have to stop the bourgeoisie from getting powerful because they threaten the government being a democracy said, okay, we're going to change the laws so that you can vote. Right? We're going to increase male suffrage so you can vote. And they do the same thing 30 years later because there's growing numbers of people who say, we have some economic power, we have some problems, there's some things we don't like about the government. And the British government says, okay, fine, we're going to give you the right to vote so you can change the government. And so because of that, because Britain's willing to expand democracy, Britain is going to maintain stable, and British people are going to choose reform over revolution. We don't need to change our democratic system, we just need to fix a few things. Right? We don't need to have a communist revolution or a socialist revolution. We can just have some reform and then we'll be okay. Now, 6, what are the basic ideas of communism? one thing, first of all, when you hear the word, first of all, I want to connect this to Karl Marx, right? When you hear the word Karl Marx, think communism. He and Friedrich Engels are kind of the founding fathers of communism. And they were, in a sense, influenced by the Enlightenment. When you think also communism and Karl Marx, think science, right? Think science. Just in a sense like Galileo is going to challenge the political and social order through science, so is Karl Marx going to do the same thing. But in his case, his science isn't astronomy. His science is history. Marx says that there are laws that govern history, scientific laws that govern history. I disagree, just as an aside, I disagree with Marx in this. I don't think history is a science. But he thought it was a science. Right, so when you think Karl Marx and communism, think science. And also think the economy. Where Marx thought that all history basically could be boiled down to economic history. He said history is driven by the economy. I study religious history. He would think I was worthless. Maybe I am, I don't know. But Marx certainly would think that. But he thought that it progressed, history, the economy drives history, and history progresses through economic stages, and each one of these economic stages is based on class conflict. Marx hated nationalism. Now, nationalism says your primary loyalty should be to your nation. Karl Marx says your primary loyalty should be towards your class. And by that I mean your economic class, so your working class, bourgeoisie, so forth. And he saw this, so history is driven by the economy and marked by different kind of class conflict. The oppressor class is the class that owns the means of production. Right? Owns the means of production. So for example, we start off, he's argued that early human beings started off with slavery. In that case, the means of production were people, and you owned people. The oppressors were the slave owners, and the oppressed were the slaves. Eventually we moved to feudalism, where the means of production was land, and the people who were powerful and were oppressing other people were land, and the people who were oppressed were the peasants. Marx thought he lived during the time period of capitalism. Capitalism is a time when the means of production are the factories and the machines. And it's the oppressed people are the factory workers, and the oppressors are the factory owners. And he thought that capitalism was going to get so bad, so terrible to people. Remember, he's living in the first half of the 19th century when it was pretty terrible. He sees it as getting so bad that eventually the workers will come together, overthrow the capitalists, and establish communism. Now, one thing I want to stress, and this is important because this is a little different from how we normally, at least when I was young, what we thought communism was. The goal of communism is actually to get rid of the government. Right? Communists do not believe that you're supposed to have a big government in the end. Communists believe essentially that class conflict drives history. They think any kind of conflict was economic conflict. So they said, well, in a communist utopia, once we get rid of capitalism, there will be no private property. We'll share everything equally. Right? We'll share everything equally. So because of that, because everything will be shared equally, we won't need a government. Because everyone will have enough. The purpose of government, according to them, was to control conflict. Well, if conflict is driven by economic inequality, by people not having enough stuff, once everyone gets enough stuff, we won't have any more conflict. And we won't need a government. Once we have no government, no one will exploit us, and we'll have perfect freedom. So the goal of communism, for example, if you think of the Soviet Union under Stalin, which was this government that controlled the aspects of everyone's life, and in many ways was very tyrannical, that was not the final goal of communism. The final goal of communism is not an all-powerful government. The final goal of communism is no government, where everyone gets as much stuff as they want or as they need, and perfect freedom. And that's kind of the goal, the final goal of communism. And basically Marx thought the workers would be pushed so far by capitalist search for profits that they would rebel. And we'll skip these parts. But he thought, I just want to stress what was really important to Marx and to the power of communism was that it was organized. Right? I don't talk much about anarchists, for example, in this class. Anarchists were important, but their big weakness was that, it sounds like a bad joke, but the main problem the anarchists had was they were disorganized. The communists, in contrast, were very well organized, formed a political party which was able to operate and to encourage revolution. And I include this picture because this, to help you kind of remember, in communism, theoretically, your class is most important. This is German, but it says, workers of the world unite. And you'll see there's workers from all over the world, from many different countries. The idea is your nation isn't important in communism, theoretically. It's your class. Okay. Any questions on communism before how did how did the face of France and Germany differ in the 19th century? This may seem kind of an odd question, but I want it to help you kind of remember the answer. I'm trying to set us up for what's going to happen in the early 20th century, which is where Germany is going to fight two major world wars. Now, remember that Germany had been disunited. There were lots of people who were of German ethnicity who spoke German, but were not united into one country. Now, there was an attempt to unite Germans through a constitution after the 1848 revolutions. It fails. So what is going to end up happening is this man, who's going to be Chancellor of Prussia, or also Prime Minister, you could say, Otto von Bismarck, he says, we're going to unite Germany through blood and iron. We're going to unite Germany through war. Right? That's why I chose this picture, because he's got his threatening Pickelhaube, his hat with the spike on it. So he's going to start wars against the Austrian Empire and France to gain control of German-speaking territories. Right? France had these territories where the people spoke German. And he said, those people are German, they should be part of our territory. And what's going to end up happening, these wars are going to be very successful, and Germany is going to become unified. That's the key word. Germany is going to become unified through this. Through these wars, all these different German governments, there's all these different governments with German people, are going to basically turn into essentially one major German government. So you're going to have growing German unification, right? German Empire wars of unification. In contrast, France, right? You have this war between Germany and France in 1870 to 71. The French are going to be defeated, right? The Germans, that's Otto von Bismarck there, actually capture the French emperor in battle, Louis Napoleon. So, and French society is going to still be divided by the French Revolution. There's French who say that the revolution was very good, back that 1789 revolution. There's other French who will say the revolution was terrible. So they're not even going to be sure what kind of government they should form for many years. So whereas Germany is going to be unified, France is going to be increasingly divided. So Germany is going to be a rising power in Europe, and France is going to be a declining power in Europe. So any questions about that? Okay, the Americas. People had lots of questions on the Americas. So I'm going to take these first two questions together. Why did Creoles in Latin America want to obtain independence from Spain and Portugal, and how were they able to obtain it? And two, what were the differences between the political and economic systems in North and South America? And why did North America, specifically the United States, become more powerful than South America? People had asked this question about caudillos. That's not on the term list, but just as a reminder, caudillo is a dictator in Latin America. So it's a reference to a Latin American dictator. So in 18th, 19th century Latin America, you had these people called Creoles. And where Creoles were full-blooded Europeans of Spanish descent who were born into the colonies. The Creoles thought that they should run the colonies. The Creoles thought they should be the people who should be in charge of the colonies. They said, after all, we're of Spanish descent. We were born here. But this is part of the Spanish Empire. So Spain sent governors who were from Spain to govern. Well, the Creoles didn't like that. So the Creoles had a political reason why they wanted independence. They were tired of the Spanish telling them what to do. Right? They said, we're of Spanish descent, we're wealthy and powerful, we want to be able to decide what's best for our colony. But the Spanish government said, no, we're going to have these Spanish military or Spanish governors in charge. So they have political reasons, right? They face discrimination from native-born Europeans, so they have political reasons. Also, remember, they rejected mercantilism. In mercantilism, you have a mother country, such as Spain, has a colony so they can get wealthy. You want the wealth from these countries. So, and I always give this example, Argentina has really good beef. So the Spanish would force the Argentinians to sell them beef at really low prices. The Argentinians knew that if they could sell their beef freely,